Now we have a caller today that was asking about Miscanthus grass, and he'd asked initially. Again, we're pulling callers that we can find with comments out there that I think help a large percentage of people.
Right.
We're not trying to get too defined into a very small segment.
Sure.
But Miscanthus Giganteus is really popular right now. And he was asking why I don't recommend it. And it's not that I don't recommend it. It's kind of hinge cuts. You recommend it 20-25% of the time on all properties. It's not a fit.
Right.
Miscanthus Giganteus is a really cool product, but you really have to know its limitations, and it doesn't work everywhere. So let's get this caller on the line. I know him a little bit. He's got a good personality, and we'll see how this conversation goes, because knowing this caller, it could go any different direction. So let's have some fun with this. But why do we not recommend planting Miscanthus grass? Or Giganteus. It's an ornamental grass. Not necessarily true that I don't recommend it. And let's dive into this discussion.
Hey Jeff, how's it going?
Good, Nick. How you doing? Hey, you're on with Dylan and I. And,
hey Dylan, how's it going?
Good. How you doing, Nick?
And I already introduced you a little bit, and I said, knowing your personality, who knows which way this conversation will go, but...
Okay, all right, fair enough.
Yeah. And
I fight a lot of Jeff's recommendations, not because I don't trust them, just because I just want to learn, so...
Yeah, and that's where, Nick, you've been... Some people I talk to where they just do everything you say, and they don't ask questions, and then you wonder if they actually understood what you recommend because they're not as engaged. You're someone that is inquisitive on every area, and that we talk about, and I'd really like to hear your opinions or thoughts or questions on Miscanthus.
Yeah, I definitely need to understand why before I can put it into action. Want to be an expert like you, and there's a lot to learn. And I'm just wondering, again, why don't you recommend it? I'm thinking about, I really need to screen all my food plots for my access, and I know my access needs to be better. And I just wonder, why is it not a good option when it seems to be something that could provide a permanent long-term screen where, a Northwoods blend, I have to replant every year, and it's kind of a tedious task.
Right.
So just I haven't planted Miscanthus yet. I know I shouldn't, and I'm just kind of wondering. I've been considering it and want to know why I should be planning it.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And kind of what we're picking with people too is we want to try to discuss questions that help the most people. As opposed to asking something that's a very small segment and having a discussion on what a deer hears, or how far. Just little things that might be kind of interesting, but they're not a huge draw or answering questions for a lot of people. This is a great time that people are online asking about Miscanthus, and
Sure.
I'm going to ask you with some of your screening. Do you have screening that you need to add that is under a power line?
Say it again. Under a power line?
Yes. Yep. Under.
I do have some. So yeah, where trees aren't necessarily an option. Some under power line, and then around that outside border of my plot.
Yes, and I understand like that. Like you have a lot of food plot space, and I guess so the power line question is one thing, but going past that, do you need the height of 10, 12, 14 feet in those areas, or can you get by with switchgrass that might be in the 6 to 8 foot range?
As long as it can cover a 7-footer, so.
So folks, you don't know Nick. Nick what is your height?
I'm
Is it 7?
6'11", 7 foot. Yep.
Yeah.
Tallest deer hunter I know. So.
Yeah, it's the tallest person I know, I think, actually. So, but and so I can appreciate you wanting to be covered up, but with switchgrass, and so that's that question with Miscanthus is why wouldn't someone plant Miscanthus versus switch, for example? And
I think for me, it all comes to, I feel like I have this reoccurring theme, but I'm about saving time, saving money, being practical about my efforts out there. Right. So right off the bat, Miscanthus is really expensive, right?
Yes.
It's also really time consuming to establish and put out there, right?
Yeah.
Because it's planting by each individual sprig or plant.
12 by 18 inch plantings. And you and I did the math before.
Yeah.
And it was we figured out, we actually dotted it out, Nick, and it was a half mile that Miscanthus would cost, for a half mile screening, 5 rows deep, it costs you at least $2,000. If you spaced out 5 to 6 foot conifers at seedling, you'd be about $150. And if you use switchgrass, you'd be under $50. And conifers will take you probably a day, day and a half to plant. And Miscanthus will take you several days to plant. And switchgrass, you'll have under an hour of total time to get it established effectively. And so going back to the question about, do you need the height for screening? Is it under a power line? If
Explain
it is under
that
a
a
power
little bit.
line,
Why under a power line matters, I think.
well, that's under a power line. You know, I've had clients where the power line's along the road and they need screening. Trees aren't an option. And because the ground rises up or the
Yep.
road is significantly higher than the area they're trying to screen, then switchgrass isn't tall enough
Right.
or
Okay.
high enough.
Sure.
And so then it gets back to, Miscanthus is a really good option for that.
Right.
But again, it's one of those, why use it if you don't have to?
Right.
There's way better options. We're all about making effective options. So that kind of make sense, Nick?
I guess I really have to focus on. It takes 3 years for Miscanthus. It also takes 3 years for switchgrass, right? So I guess what's the time saving?
Oh, that's really good. You brought that up too, because in northern settings, we're seeing Miscanthus take 6 to 8 years to be fully established, and in southern locations, we're seeing 3 years. And if a switchgrass field is established correctly with chemicals and you get a weed-free plot growing, we're seeing by year 2 in, say, central Wisconsin over to southern Minnesota, lower Michigan, over to Pennsylvania, to central New York, and then south on that line, we're seeing 90-95% growth at the end of year 2. So even then, you're comparing 2 years to 7 or 8 years, depending on your location too.
So it's establishing faster, cheaper, for less effort. I mean, what's not to love?
Well, and even if you look at it that way, the percentage even, you're comparing like a half mile line that's 20 feet wide.
Yeah.
You're comparing $50 to $2,000 plus.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so that, and I think, Nick, you'd ask, there's another common question about mixing.
I saw some stuff online where you could mix the switchgrass with like a Northwoods whitetail blend, and have your tall screen the first year, and then your switchgrass comes up the next year.
Which
Dylan,
we just
can
had
answer that one.
another conversation about this on a previous video, but switchgrass is not shade tolerant, doesn't do well with competition. So if you're introducing that into a stand of something else, that switchgrass just is not going to establish and become viable as a stand. It's not going to have that direct sunlight that it needs to become that solid block of switchgrass to be screening. So yeah, for the first year, you might have a solid, screening of that annual planting, but that perennial switchgrass blend just is not going to establish effectively.
Yeah, and what we find, so switchgrass is even killed by taller varieties of switchgrass. So you have short variety switchgrass, tall variety switchgrasses. People put it into mix and call it the latest, greatest proprietary blend of bedding mix or screening mix, but then the short variety is killed out and it's just a waste of money. And that applies. What we find is if the screening is thick enough that it's a viable screen in November and December, like the Northwoods Whitetail HD screening, then it's going to shade out and kill the switchgrass. And on the flip side, if the switchgrass is receiving enough sunlight within that HD screening mix to actually be viable switchgrass and grow the following year, then that means you have zero screening in November and December of that actual screening blend for that first year. So I look at a different option.
Yep.
I look at if switchgrass is appropriate, and you could even say if Miscanthus grass was appropriate. Let's say that you had Miscanthus grass and you wanted to get a quicker growing product in the interim, and you're screening off a food plot, and it was under that power line, for example. Then I would put the screening blend on the inside of the Miscanthus or switchgrass, but especially the switch in most cases. And then when the switch or the Miscanthus grass is viable, then I'm turning in that annual HD screening mix to food plot space. So, and you don't need as much food plot space usually when you're first installing them, because the deer have to establish a pattern of use, and typically your population is increasing over time, not decreasing.
Do you have one like facing south or closest to the sun, or does it matter where you layer the HD screen with the switchgrass?
Well, if you're doing it up against a food plot, you obviously want to put whichever side you're going to be taking out on the food plot side, if that makes sense. So that whatever
you're the screening blend.
Yeah. Okay. So you would want the switchgrass or whatever you want to be the longer term on the south side, towards more sunlight.
Right.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. And then if it was on the north side of the plot, I'd still plant the switchgrass. And what you're going to find is that first year, the switchgrass will get 3-4 feet high. You might have some dieback about 2 feet back into the stand. So you plan ahead for that, maybe 3 feet. And then you'd have that screening blend towards the food plot. And then eventually that screening blend and that empty space would be converted to food plots. So Nick, that's a good question, because you would need to stack. Does that make sense? Maybe 3 feet away, 4 feet away from that switch.
To make sure the sun can do it, sure.
Yes, yeah, because the switch isn't, it's not like you're planting it next to hardwoods or even 5-year-old aspen clear cutting or something where you have 15-foot, 20-foot high growth. So, and I like, even with those screening blends, a lot of times I'm looking at a higher amount of seed planted a little bit later in the year, so that you can expect that thick stand that doesn't blow over with winds or heavy snow.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, I guess that answers my question on my short-term and long-term needs. So.
Cool. Yeah. Well, Nick, it is always great talking to you. I appreciate the question. Like I said, we're looking for questions that help the most people, and I think this is a good one from today. So. What do you have on top for your whitetail activities coming up over this month? We just shot our March deer chores, and I don't know if you have any cutting to do right now coming up in the near future.
Saturday and Sunday I was dropping timber
Nice.
per your recommendation. So
Yeah.
I do appreciate you coming and looking at my property and give me the advice there. I think it's going to make a big difference.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate Nick. We appreciate the call, and we'll talk to you later.
All right, take care.
Now, as we transition into habitat season, I hope you've had a chance to check out my web class, How to Design Your Whitetail Parcel. It's on my website, whitetailhabitatsolutions.com. I have a link in the description, and I hope you can find it, check it out, and enjoy it this year.